I'm plain and not pretty, she breathed. The hunter said, perfect. I crave truth, not false beauty. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Clara had spent most of her life in a small, unremarkable town. People didn't speak to her unless they had to, and when they did, their eyes often lingered on her plain features. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't beautiful either. She was just ordinary. Her hair was too straight, her eyes too dull, and her figure too rounded for the standard of beauty the world had set. Clara had always known she was different, but not in the way that made her stand out for good reasons. No one seemed to notice her unless it was to mock her or to pity her. Clara spent her days in the garden or sweeping the floor of the small house she called home. She was used to the silence, to the way people would ignore her in town or cast glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. But the silence didn't bother her anymore. It had become her companion. Her mother used to say that beauty was only skin deep, but the world didn't seem to care about that. Clara's mother had passed away years ago, and since then, Clara had carried on, doing what was expected of her, but never feeling like she fit in anywhere. That day, Clara had gone to the market to buy flour. The air was crisp, and the wind whipped through the trees, rattling the bare branches. It was midwinter, and the town was quieter than usual. She walked through the market square, head down, trying to avoid the usual whispers and stares. But today, something was different. As Clara walked past the blacksmith's shop, she heard a voice. You're not as plain as they say. She froze. The voice was low, smooth, and deep, as though it had come from somewhere far away. She looked up, startled, and met the eyes of a man she had never seen before. He was standing by a horse, his hand resting on the reins. His features were sharp, his eyes dark, but there was something in them that made her feel seen. What? Clara stammered, unsure if she had heard him correctly. The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I said, you're not as plain as they say. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She was used to being invisible, to blending into the background. But this man, this stranger, was looking at her as if he could see her, really see her, for the first time in her life. His gaze was steady and unflinching, and for a moment, Clara felt her heart beat faster in her chest. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My name is Ethan, the man replied, and I'm a hunter, but I'm no stranger to loneliness, or to the way the world looks at people like you. Clara wasn't sure what to say. She had no idea who this man was, but his words had struck a chord deep within her. I don't understand, Clara said, her voice trembling. Why would you say that? Why would you say I'm not plain? Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he were looking into her very soul. Because, Clara, he said, his voice softening, I crave truth, not false beauty. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Clara felt something stir inside her, a feeling she had never known before. Something warm, something real. She didn't know it yet, but this encounter would change her life forever. I have to admit, Clara had never thought she would meet someone like Ethan. As the days passed, his words echoed in her mind. I crave truth, not false beauty. Clara couldn't shake them. For the first time, someone had seen through the surface, through all the judgments and expectations, and had recognized something real in her. It was unsettling and, in some strange way, liberating. Over the next few weeks, she tried to go about her usual routines, but everything felt different. She no longer hid from the world. She walked with her head held higher, even though she still heard the whispers from the townspeople. But Clara was beginning to understand that those whispers didn't define her. Ethan had started visiting her family's farm regularly. He wasn't someone who liked to be seen or to speak much. His visits were brief, usually under the guise of needing supplies or checking on the livestock. Yet, every time he came, Clara couldn't help but feel that there was more to his presence than simple kindness. He didn't pity her. He respected her, which was something she had never experienced before. Ethan wasn't the type to share much about himself, but Clara didn't mind. She had grown accustomed to silence. His eyes told her more than words ever could. His actions were always deliberate, always protective. He would help her with the heavy work in the barn, lifting crates and hay bales without breaking a sweat, his quiet demeanor reassuring her in ways she couldn't quite explain. One chilly evening, as Clara was stacking firewood in the barn, Ethan appeared out of the dusk, his silhouette dark against the fading light. He didn't announce himself, just stood at the threshold, watching her work. Clara paused, wiping a strand of hair from her face, and met his gaze. The cold wind tugged at her, but she felt warm inside. "You don't have to keep doing this," Clara said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, stepping into the barn. Clara hesitated. "Helping me. I'm just a woman, no better than anyone else in this town," she muttered, avoiding his eyes. Ethan walked closer, his boots softly crunching against the dirt floor. He reached out and touched her arm, his hand warm and steady. "You're not just anyone," he said quietly. "You're someone who's worth protecting. Someone who's worth more than the world's judgment." Clara swallowed hard, her breath catching in her chest. She could feel her pulse quicken, but there was no fear. There was only the strange sense that Ethan was telling her something important, something she had never dared to believe about herself. Ethan's hand lingered on her arm, and for a moment, Clara thought he might say something more. But instead, he just stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's a storm coming," he said simply. Clara nodded, unsure of how to respond. The storm was coming, not just in the weather, but in the way Ethan made her feel. She felt something shifting within her, something stronger than the loneliness she had lived with for years. As she worked alongside him, she realized just how much she had missed the feeling of being seen for who she truly was. That night, after Ethan left, Clara lay awake in bed, the winds howling outside her window. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't just the cold wind and the rain that kept her up. It was the overwhelming sense of change. Ethan had opened something inside her, something long locked away. The next morning, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the woods, watching the trees bend in the storm. She could hear Ethan's words again. "I crave truth, not false beauty." And for the first time in her life, Clara understood. She wasn't just the woman they all saw. She was more than that. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to start believing it. I didn't know it yet, but that morning would mark the beginning of a new life for Clara. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind only the damp smell of earth and the soft patter of rain on the roof. She stood at the window of her small cabin, staring out into the misty landscape, feeling the weight of Ethan's words still lingering in her chest. "You're worth more than the world's judgment." The thought echoed in her mind, louder than the storm had ever been. She had lived her entire life quietly, blending into the background, always told she wasn't enough. But now, with Ethan's quiet confidence in her, something inside Clara had shifted. She wasn't sure how to explain it, but she knew she could no longer hide in the shadows of self-doubt. The next few days passed in a blur of new beginnings. Clara worked harder than ever on the farm, no longer feeling weighed down by the whispers of the past. With Ethan's visits becoming more frequent, she felt something grow between them, something that was more than just friendship. He never spoke much about himself, but Clara began to notice the subtle gestures, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the protective way he stood near her when others came too close. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara was sitting on the porch, staring at the fading sunset. The sky was a deep orange, the light soft and warm, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt like she belonged in the world. Ethan walked up to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped just short of her, standing silently for a moment, before he spoke. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about running from everything." Clara didn't answer right away. She had told him about the life she had been running from, about the way people had treated her in town, about how she felt like an outsider, even in her own home. She had never said those things out loud before, and now, with Ethan standing before her, it felt like she was finally being heard. "You don't have to run anymore," Ethan continued, his eyes meeting hers. "You've already started to stand tall, Clara, and that's what makes you stronger than anyone who ever doubted you." Clara felt a tightness in her chest, a strange mixture of emotions that made it hard to speak. But Ethan's words settled deep in her heart. She hadn't realized it before, but he was right. She had been running, not just from the judgment of others, but from her own fear of never being enough. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to fit into a mold that didn't belong to her. But now, with Ethan beside her, she realized she didn't have to run anymore. She was enough. She looked up at Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Ethan stepped forward, reaching out to gently take her hand in his. "You are," he said simply, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "You always have been." Clara's heart raced as she looked at him. The air between them felt charged, but not with the heaviness of doubt. There was something pure in his gaze, something that made Clara feel safe, something that made her believe for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible. They stood there for a moment, hand in hand, the world outside seeming to fade away. And for Clara, it felt like the first real moment of peace she had ever known. But peace, Clara soon realized, wouldn't last forever. The world she had been trying to escape was always just one step behind her, ready to pull her back into the life she had once known. It wasn't long before news of Clara's newfound strength spread through the town. The whispers that once followed her now seemed to shift. Some people admired her resilience, while others whispered that she had changed too much, that she had become too different from the woman they once knew. But Clara didn't care anymore. She wasn't the same person she had been before. She was stronger now, and she didn't need anyone's approval to know that. A few weeks later, Clara was walking to the market when she saw them. The men who had once mocked her, the ones who had whispered behind her back. They were standing outside the saloon, laughing and talking as if nothing had changed. Clara took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the tension rise in her chest, the familiar fear creeping back in. But then she remembered Ethan's words. "You're stronger than they are." With that thought in mind, Clara walked past them, her head held high. The men fell silent as she passed, their eyes wide with surprise. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to. For the first time, she realized that she didn't need anyone to define her worth. She had already found it within herself. I cannot say exactly when it happened, but Clara knew things had changed. After the confrontation at the market, where the whispers had shifted from mockery to uncertainty, Clara started walking taller. The town she had once feared, the people who had once looked through her, now seemed to notice her in ways she hadn't imagined. There was a new sense of respect in the air, even though she had never asked for it. But the hardest part, Clara realized, wasn't the change in the way others saw her. It was the change in the way she saw herself. She had always believed she was plain, ordinary, invisible. But with Ethan by her side, Clara began to recognize that she was none of those things. She had strength, resilience, and a quiet beauty that came from within. Ethan's presence, his support, had awakened something in her that she had buried long ago. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a connection, a bond that was stronger than anything she had ever felt before. Ethan wasn't just a protector. He was someone who understood her, who saw her for who she truly was. And that made all the difference. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them only grew stronger. Clara found herself sharing more with Ethan, the way her heart had broken when her mother had passed, the loneliness she had felt for years. Ethan listened without judgment, offering quiet comfort. There were no grand gestures, no promises of forever, just a steady presence in her life that made her feel like she wasn't so alone anymore. Yet, despite everything, Clara couldn't shake the fear that something was bound to happen. It was as if the world wouldn't allow her happiness to last. She had spent her life on the edge, just surviving, and she didn't know how to trust in anything permanent. One evening, as Clara and Ethan sat by the fire after a long day of work, Clara spoke the words that had been lingering in her heart. "Ethan," she said softly, "what happens when the world remembers who I am? When the whispers start again?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply gazed into the fire, his expression unreadable. Clara waited, feeling the tension in the air. Finally, he spoke. "The world may remember what it wants," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "But that doesn't change who you are. Not to me." Clara swallowed hard, her heart racing. "But what if it's not enough? What if I'm still nothing?" Ethan turned to her then, his gaze intense. "You are everything, Clara. You've always been everything." Clara didn't know what to say. She had always been afraid of being nothing, of being cast aside and forgotten. But Ethan's words, his certainty, made her question that fear. Maybe, for the first time, she was starting to believe in herself. As the days went on, the fear of being rejected, of being nothing, began to fade. Clara started to step into her own, to embrace the woman she was becoming. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the world seemed too heavy, but with Ethan by her side, she found the courage to face them. But just when Clara thought she had finally found peace, the world came crashing back into her life. One afternoon, as Clara was tending to the garden, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the unmistakable clothes of a lawman. Clara's heart skipped a beat as he approached, his horse's hooves clopping against the ground. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Clara stood frozen, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The lawman dismounted and walked toward her. "Is this the Whitmore farm?" he asked, his voice cold and businesslike. Clara nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "I need to speak to your father," the lawman said, his eyes scanning the property. Clara's heart sank. Her father had been long gone, and there was nothing left for him to claim. But the lawman's gaze narrowed, his suspicion clear. "Where is your father?" he asked again, his tone demanding an answer. "My father is no longer here," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "It's just me now." The lawman stared at her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "I'm looking for a man by the name of Ethan," he said, his eyes flicking over her with a new intensity. "You know him?" Clara's mind raced. Ethan had never told her much about his past, but she knew enough to understand that this wasn't just a casual visit. The lawman was here for something more than a simple conversation. "I know him," Clara said slowly, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "What is this about?" The lawman didn't answer, only glanced around once more before turning to leave. "Tell him to come and see me," he called over his shoulder. "He won't be able to hide forever." As the man rode off, Clara stood there, her thoughts a whirlwind. What had Ethan done? What was he running from? And why had this lawman come looking for him now? The world had come knocking again, and Clara wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was clear. Ethan's past was far from finished with him. And now, neither was her own. "I never imagined that one conversation could change everything." But that's exactly what happened after the lawman left. Clara stood there, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. Ethan, the lawman had come looking. For him, but why? What did this mean for them, for their future? Clara tried to shake off the unease gnawing at her, but it was hard. The past had always been a shadow hanging over Ethan, but now, it seemed to have caught up with them both. The moment she had feared, the one she had hoped would never come, was here. Ethan's past was coming back to find him. It didn't take long for Ethan to return that night, his silhouette framed by the dim light as he approached the cabin. Clara had been waiting for him, her heart beating faster with every second. When he finally walked through the door, the tension in the air was palpable. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable, and Clara knew immediately that something was wrong. "You spoke to him, didn't you?" Clara asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan's face hardened, but his voice remained calm. "You know I did," he replied, stepping further into the cabin. "I've been waiting for this moment, Clara. I knew it would come eventually." Clara's stomach dropped. "What is it they want? Why are they looking for you?" Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his gaze drifting to the floor. "It's not just me they want," he said quietly. "It's the things I've done, the things I've tried to leave behind." Clara's heart ached as she watched him. She had always known that Ethan had a past, but this was something deeper, something darker. She wanted to understand, but the fear in his eyes made her hesitant. "You don't have to face this alone," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We'll face it together, whatever it is." Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at her, but the sadness in them was unmistakable. "I wish it were that simple," he whispered. "But the people I've crossed, they don't forget. And they don't forgive." Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we'll run. We'll leave and start over somewhere else. We don't have to stay here, Ethan." Ethan shook his head, pulling his hand away. "It's not that easy, Clara. You don't understand. I can't just leave, not after everything I've done." Clara's chest tightened at his words. "What have you done, Ethan? What's so bad that you can't leave it behind?" Ethan didn't answer. right away. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out into the night. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke. I wasn't always this person, Clara. I was once part of a gang, a group of outlaws who did terrible things. I thought I could leave it all behind, but they won't let me. Not until they get what they want. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she processed his words. She had never imagined Ethan being part of something so dark. But as she looked at him, she saw the regret in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with the weight of his past. I'm not that man anymore, he said quietly. I've tried to live differently, tried to make up for the things I've done. But they don't care. They'll keep coming after me. And now they'll come after you too, if they think you're protecting me. Clara's mind raced as she tried to understand what this meant for her. She had thought she was just starting to find peace, just starting to believe in herself, in their connection. But now, it seemed like everything was unraveling. We don't have to face them alone, Clara said, her voice firm. We can figure this out together, Ethan. I won't let you go through this by yourself. Ethan turned back to her, his face softening. I wish I could believe you, Clara. I do. But you don't know what they're capable of. They've already hurt people to get to me. If you stay here, they'll hurt you too. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then we'll leave. We'll go to a place where they can't find us. Ethan's face tightened. That's what I've been trying to avoid. If I leave, they'll follow. It's not just about running away, Clara. It's about facing what I've done, facing the consequences. I can't ask you to be a part of that. Clara's heart ached at the way he spoke, like he was trying to protect her by pushing her away. But she wasn't going to let him do that. She had already made her choice. She wouldn't let him go through this alone. Ethan, I've chosen to be here with you. I've chosen to fight for this, for us. Whatever you've done, we'll figure it out together. We don't have to run. We face this head on, together. Ethan looked at her, his expression conflicted, torn between wanting to protect her and wanting to trust her. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping in resignation. You don't make it easy, he said with a small smile, though the sadness in his eyes remained. Clara stepped forward, taking his hand again. Good, she whispered. Because nothing worth having is easy. They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on them. But for the first time, Clara felt like they were in this together, facing whatever came next, side by side. I can't remember the last time Clara had felt this alive. With Ethan by her side, she had slowly started to believe that she was worth something, that she wasn't just the invisible woman she had once been. The world outside seemed less daunting when she was with him. But as much as she had begun to believe in their future, the reality of their situation hung over them like a storm cloud. They couldn't hide forever. The lawman's visit had only confirmed it. They needed to make a decision, and it couldn't wait much longer. Ethan was pacing back and forth in the small cabin, the dim light from the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Clara could see the worry etched in his face, the lines of stress deepening with every passing moment. He had been trying to figure out a plan, a way to protect her and keep her safe from the past that still hunted him. But the more he thought, the more the weight of it all pressed down on him. He couldn't protect her forever. He couldn't outrun his past. Clara watched him, her heart aching for the man she had come to care for. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the guilt that haunted him, and she knew that no matter what happened, he would carry it with him. But she had made her choice. She wasn't going anywhere. She wouldn't leave him. Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face her, his gaze intense. Clara, I can't keep dragging you into this. You don't know what they'll do when they find out where we are. You don't know what kind of people they are. Clara stood up and walked over to him, her footsteps firm and sure. I know exactly who they are, Ethan. I've heard the stories. I've seen the way they treat people. But I also know that I can't let you face this alone. Ethan shook his head, his hands running through his hair in frustration. I'm trying to protect you, Clara. I'm trying to keep you safe. Clara stepped closer to him, her eyes soft but determined. You're not alone in this. I've made my decision. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not letting you push me away. We face this together. For a moment, Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. But Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between wanting to protect her and not wanting her to be dragged into his mess. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. You're stubborn, you know that? Clara smiled faintly, feeling the tension in the room shift slightly. I've been told that before, she said softly. Ethan sighed and ran a hand over his face. I don't know what's going to happen, Clara. I don't know if I can protect you from this. But if you're in this, then we do this together. No more hiding. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't fear that she felt, not anymore. It was the feeling of knowing she had made the right choice. They would face whatever came their way, together. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara found herself lost in thought. Ethan had told her about his past, about the gang, about the things he had done. He had been part of something dangerous, something that had left its mark on him, and now the consequences of those actions were catching up to them. It was hard to imagine the man she knew, the one who had been kind and patient with her, as the person he had once been. But Clara didn't care about his past. She cared about who he was now, and who he was becoming. She knew he would never go back to that life. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Clara's thoughts drifted to the future. What would it look like? What if the lawman came back? Or worse, what if the gang found them? Clara didn't know the answers, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was with Ethan, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, they made a decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but they had to move. They couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. They would leave, start fresh somewhere new, where no one knew who they were, where Ethan's past couldn't catch up to them. It was risky, but it was the only option they had. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Clara felt ready to face it. As they packed their things, Ethan turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in days. Are you sure about this? He asked. Clara smiled, her hand resting on his arm. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said. And in that moment, Clara realized that this was the beginning of something new. Not just a new chapter in her life, but a new life altogether. A life she was ready to embrace, with Ethan by her side. They would face whatever came their way, together. Clara and Ethan didn't waste time. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they packed up their few belongings and set out, knowing the world they were leaving behind would soon be a distant memory. The old cabin, the small town, the people who had never seen her for anything more than what they expected, all of it would fade into the background. For Clara, the most terrifying part wasn't the journey ahead. It was the uncertainty of what lay beyond it. Could they really start over? Could she, in particular, truly leave everything behind and build a new life from scratch? Ethan, ever the quiet presence at her side, didn't seem to have the same doubts. He moved with purpose, always a few steps ahead, his mind already focused on the road. But Clara, despite the determination she had found within herself, couldn't help but glance over her shoulder once in a while, as if waiting for something, or someone, to catch up with them. The morning was cool, the air crisp and fresh, and as they made their way down the familiar path toward the next town, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't an obvious sense, but the way the wind shifted, the way the birds suddenly stopped chirping, made her heart race. Do you feel that? Clara asked, glancing sideways at Ethan. He didn't answer right away, but his hand subtly moved toward the rifle slung across his back. I feel it, he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. We keep moving. No stopping until we reach the next town. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. They had planned this route carefully, off the beaten path, through the woods, and toward a small village a few days' travel away. No one would recognize them there. No one would care about the past that they both wanted to leave behind. They had enough supplies to make it, and Clara's heart told her that this was the only way forward. As they continued on, Clara began to feel the weight of the journey pressing down on her. Every step seemed heavier than the last, and the constant rustling of the leaves and the sound of footsteps in the underbrush made her jump. It's nothing, Ethan reassured her, though his voice was taut with tension. Just the forest. But Clara knew better. The feeling of being followed hadn't disappeared. It had only grown stronger, more insistent. Ethan, Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. I think we're being followed. Ethan stopped walking, his hand tightening on the rifle. He motioned for Clara to stay still. Without another word, he moved silently into the trees, blending with the shadows like a man who had spent his life in the wilderness. Clara stood frozen, trying to quiet her breathing. Every instinct told her to run, but she couldn't leave him behind. She trusted him too much. A few minutes passed, each one dragging like an eternity. Clara's heart beat faster, and she strained her ears to listen for any sign of movement. Then, just as she was about to call out to Ethan, he emerged from the woods, his face grim. "We need to go? Now." Clara didn't ask any more questions. She nodded and followed him, her legs moving automatically as they began to run, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. For hours, they kept moving, faster than they ever had before, pushing through the dense forest with only the occasional glance behind them. The sun had long since disappeared behind the trees, and the shadows stretched out like dark fingers. But Clara felt the urgency in Ethan's movements. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about survival. When they finally stopped, hours later, Ethan led them to a small creek where they could rest. Clara collapsed onto the ground, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't complain. The fear that had been gnawing at her for so long finally took its toll. Ethan knelt beside her, pulling out a small pouch of food from his bag. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly. "We can't stop for long." Clara nodded, but she couldn't help but ask the question that had been on her mind. "Who's following us?" Ethan's face tightened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "They're from my past. People I used to run with. The gang I told you about. They've come looking for me." Clara's heart sank. She had known, deep down, that they wouldn't escape so easily. But hearing Ethan say it out loud made it real. "They'll stop at nothing," Ethan continued. "They'll find us, Clara. And they'll come for you too." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been afraid of this, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to feel. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. She couldn't let Ethan face this alone. "We won't let them catch us," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fear that still gripped her heart. "We'll keep moving. Together." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes softened. "I wish I could promise you this will all be over soon. But the truth is, we don't know what's coming." Clara nodded, determination setting in. "Then we keep going." The road ahead was uncertain, and they both knew it. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. As they packed up to leave the creek and continue on their journey, Clara felt something shift inside her. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't running from her past. She was facing it head-on, with Ethan by her side. The journey had only just begun, but Clara could already feel the weight of their decision. Every step they took, every new mile between them and the life they had known, brought them closer to a future that seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. The days were long, the nights colder, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead never seemed to lessen. The fear of being followed, of being caught, hung over them like a cloud that would never dissipate. But through it all, Clara felt a strange sense of clarity. She was not running anymore. She was choosing her path, her future. She had made that choice the moment she decided to stand by Ethan, no matter the cost. They had been traveling for days, through thick forests and rocky paths, always pushing forward. Ethan had remained quiet, his focus on the trail ahead, but Clara knew that he was constantly scanning the environment, checking for signs of danger. She admired his strength, his ability to remain calm under pressure. It was something she had never truly experienced before, peace in the midst of chaos. But as the sun began to set on the fourth day, Clara felt a shift. She could sense Ethan's unease, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand never far from the rifle slung over his shoulder. Something was different, and Clara knew it wasn't just the weight of their journey. They had stopped to rest in a small clearing when the tension broke. Ethan's expression changed, the lines on his face deepening as he suddenly stood up, his gaze fixed on the trees in the distance. Clara immediately felt the shift in the air. Something was coming. Ethan moved swiftly, pulling Clara to her feet as he scanned the surroundings. "Stay close," he whispered urgently, his voice barely above a breath. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to ask what was happening. She knew. The gang had found them. The sound of horses in the distance confirmed her fears. Ethan grabbed her arm, guiding her through the thick brush as quietly as possible. They had to move fast, but they couldn't afford to make any noise. Clara's pulse raced, her breaths coming in short gasps as they ran through the undergrowth. The noise of hooves grew louder, the sound of men shouting in the distance sending a chill down her spine. Clara stumbled but quickly regained her footing, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan's grip on her tightened as they moved faster. They had to find cover, somewhere to hide before they were discovered. The woods were dense, but they couldn't outrun them forever. Clara's mind raced. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running. The fear of being caught, of losing everything, threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had made a promise. They would make it out of this together. Just as they reached the edge of a thick cluster of trees, Ethan stopped, his eyes scanning the area. He held up a hand, signaling Clara to stop. She froze, trying to control her breathing, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound of the riders was close now, and Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan crouched low, pulling Clara down beside him. They were hidden for the moment, but the danger was still very real. Ethan's eyes met hers, his face serious. "Listen to me, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to make it out of here. You have to trust me, but we can't let them know we're here. We stay hidden, we wait for them to pass, and then we move again. If we're spotted, we fight, understood?" Clara nodded, though the fear in her chest made it hard to focus. "Understood," she whispered. Ethan's hand moved to the rifle at his side, his body tense and ready for anything. They sat in silence, barely breathing, as the sound of the riders drew nearer. Clara could hear their voices now, rough and loud, as they called to each other, unaware of the two people hidden just yards away. The tension was unbearable, and Clara's mind raced. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't lose Ethan. Not now. Not after everything they had already been through. The riders were close, just a few feet away, when one of them called out, his voice booming in the silence of the forest. "They're here somewhere. Keep looking." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she shrank back further into the shadows. The sound of hooves grew louder again, and the riders began to fan out, searching the trees. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for Ethan's, her fingers clutching him tightly. He didn't say anything, but she felt the tension in his body, the way he was poised, ready to react at a moment's notice. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the riders moved away, their voices fading as they continued their search in the opposite direction. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her heart was racing, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, making sure they were truly gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "We move now? Stay close." Clara nodded, still processing what had just happened. They weren't safe yet, but they had survived. And that, in that moment, was enough. The night felt colder now, as Clara and Ethan moved deeper into the wilderness. They had been running for days, but the fear of being caught never seemed to leave them. Even when the riders had passed them by earlier, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. She kept glancing behind them, her senses on edge, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs making her jump. But Ethan remained calm, his pace steady and sure. He didn't seem afraid. He seemed determined. The exhaustion weighed heavily on Clara's body, but she knew they couldn't afford to rest for too long. Not when they were this close to the next town, to safety. The road ahead was still dangerous, but at least it was a step forward, away from the shadows that had chased them for so long. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. "We're almost there. We'll stop at the river, rest for the night. Tomorrow, we make the last stretch." Clara nodded, her throat dry, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. They couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the past, and Clara wasn't sure she was ready for that. When they reached the river, it was nearly midnight, the water flowing fast and cold, moonlight reflecting off the surface like silver. Ethan set up a small campfire, the crackling flames a comfort in the otherwise silent night. Clara sat beside him, the warmth from the fire chasing away some of the chill in her bones, but not the worry in her mind. She had seen the way Ethan reacted when the riders had come close. She had seen the guilt in his eyes. He was running from something, someone, and that someone would stop at nothing to find him. Clara didn't know exactly what Ethan's past held, but she knew it was bad. She had always felt like there was more to his story, that there was something he was hiding from her. And tonight, she couldn't ignore it any longer. "Ethan," She began softly, not sure how to ask, but knowing she had to. What happened? What are we really running from? Ethan didn't look at her right away. He poked the fire with a stick, the embers glowing brightly. The silence between them stretched, the weight of his unspoken words pressing down on Clara. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with regret. It's not something I wanted to tell you, Clara, but it's the truth. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts, before continuing. I used to be part of a gang. We did terrible things, things I can't take back. But I left. I walked away from it all. I tried to make a life for myself, to live differently. But they don't just let you go. They don't forget. Clara's heart raced as she listened, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted to know everything, to understand the man beside her, the man she had come to care for so deeply. Ethan looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. The people I was with, they won't stop until they find me. They've already hurt others to get to me. And now, they'll hurt you too, Clara. If they think you're helping me, they'll take everything from you. They'll make you pay for what I've done. Clara's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She had known there was something dark in Ethan's past, but hearing it laid bare made it all too real. And yet, despite the fear rising inside her, she refused to let it control her. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stand by him. I'm not afraid of them, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I'm not afraid of what they might do. I'm with you, Ethan. We're in this together. Ethan's eyes met hers then, and for the first time in days, she saw a flicker of something different in them, something like hope. You don't know what you're saying, he said quietly. They're dangerous. They've killed before. They'll do whatever it takes to get to me. Clara reached out, taking his hand in hers. I know what I'm saying, she replied. You've done bad things, but you're not that person anymore. And I believe you when you say you've changed. We'll face this together, whatever happens. Ethan squeezed her hand, the strength in his grip reassuring her, even though she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The fire crackled softly as they sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly easing. Clara could hear the water rushing nearby, the sound of the river both soothing and ominous. She knew that soon they would have to face whatever was waiting for them on the other side. The lawmen, the gang, it didn't matter. They would face it all together. As the night stretched on, Clara found herself falling asleep beside the fire, Ethan's presence a steady comfort. When she woke the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, the sky streaked with orange and pink. They had a long day ahead of them, and Clara knew they had to be ready. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The sun had barely risen when Clara and Ethan set out again, their footsteps quiet against the soft earth beneath them. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the promise of a new day hanging in the air. But Clara knew that despite the beauty of the morning, their situation hadn't changed. They were still running, still hiding, and the weight of the danger they faced hung over them like a dark cloud. Ethan moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the landscape, always alert. Clara followed closely behind, doing her best to keep up, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. They had to reach the next town, but they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They had to stay one step ahead of the gang that was hunting them, one step ahead of the lawman who was still looking for Ethan. The road ahead wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the past and the consequences of Ethan's choices. Clara didn't know how much longer they could keep running. The further they went, the more she realized that they couldn't outrun their past forever. It was only a matter of time before they were found. And when they were, Clara didn't know what would happen. She glanced at Ethan, trying to gauge his mood, but he remained silent, his face unreadable. It was the same way he had been since they left the river. Clara knew he was carrying the weight of everything on his shoulders. He didn't want her to be caught in the middle of it, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding some kind of peace. The road was long, and the miles stretched out ahead of them like a never-ending journey. As the day wore on, the landscape around them began to change. The trees thinned, and the ground became more rocky, the terrain harder to navigate. They slowed their pace, careful not to make too much noise, always listening for any sign of pursuit. The sun was high in the sky by the time they reached a small clearing. Ethan stopped, his hand raised in a gesture that told Clara to be quiet. She froze immediately, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened intently. There was nothing at first, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, in the distance, Clara heard the unmistakable sound of hooves. Her stomach dropped. The riders were getting closer. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hard. "We have to move, now," he whispered, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the tree line. Clara's heart raced as they moved quickly through the underbrush, her feet stumbling over roots and rocks. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer. She could feel the tension in Ethan's body, his grip on her arm firm but not painful. He was trying to keep her close, keep her safe, but Clara could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had been pushing them both for days, but now, as the riders neared, she could see the strain starting to show. They reached a small ridge, the trees thick around them, and Ethan motioned for Clara to crouch low. They ducked behind a large rock, their bodies pressed close together as they listened to the riders approaching. Clara's breath came in short gasps, the fear bubbling up in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, to remain silent. She could hear the men talking now, their voices growing louder. "They can't be far," one of them said. Clara's stomach turned. She didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. Ethan's hand was still tight around hers, his fingers steady. He was waiting, calculating the next move, but Clara could feel the tension in his body. He knew this was a dangerous moment. They couldn't stay here for long. They couldn't keep hiding. The sound of the riders stopped just a few feet away from their position, and Clara held her breath, praying that they wouldn't be discovered. She could feel Ethan's pulse quicken, his body coiled with readiness. But then, just as quickly as they had stopped, the riders moved away, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara exhaled, her heart still pounding in her chest. She glanced at Ethan, who was staring into the distance, his eyes narrowed. They weren't out of danger yet. Ethan didn't speak for a moment, just waited until the sounds of the riders were completely gone. Then, with a deep breath, he stood up, pulling Clara to her feet. "We move, now," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara nodded, her heart still racing, and followed him as they continued their journey. They didn't speak much after that, the silence between them filled with the weight of what they had just survived. But as the hours passed and the landscape began to change once again, Clara found herself thinking about what Ethan had said earlier, about facing the past, about not running anymore. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay by his side, no matter the consequences. And whatever happened next, Clara knew that she wouldn't run. Not from Ethan. Not from the past. They would face it together. By the time the sun began to set, Clara could see the outline of a small town in the distance. They were close, but Clara didn't feel the relief she had expected. She wasn't sure if the danger had passed or if it was just beginning. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of their journey. The past would catch up with them. But for now, they had made it this far, together. The town loomed ahead like a shadow on the horizon, its edges softened by the fading sunlight. Clara felt a mixture of relief and tension as they approached. The journey had been long, and the fear of being followed never truly left her. Every rustle of wind, every distant sound seemed like a threat, a reminder that danger was never far behind. Ethan remained quiet beside her, his expression unreadable, but Clara could sense the tension in his body. He was always alert, always watching, always waiting for something, or someone, to appear. They had covered many miles in the past few days, and the small town before them promised at least a temporary safe haven. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested people had learned to keep to themselves, not ask questions, and not offer help unless absolutely necessary. It felt like the kind of place that would let them slip by unnoticed. But Clara knew better. No place would stay hidden forever, not with people like the ones chasing them. They approached the edge of town, their footsteps muffled by the dirt roads. The first building they passed was a small, run-down inn. The shutters were closed, and the windows were covered with thick curtains. There were no signs of life inside, but the door creaked as it opened to reveal a man in his late 50s, tall and wiry, his face hardened by years of weathering the harsh elements. He eyed them as they walked by, but his gaze didn't linger. He had seen their kind before. "You two planning to stay?" The man's voice was rough, but not unfriendly. Clara stopped, her heart skipping a beat. Ethan gave her a look, one that said stay calm, but it was hard to read the expression in his eyes. He nodded slightly toward the man. "We might. Just passing through." The man didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. "This town doesn't get many visitors," he said slowly, as if deciding whether or not to offer any more information. "Not the safest place to be if you don't know anyone." Clara didn't like the way he said that. She could feel the tension creeping up her spine. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the man. "We'll be fine," he replied, his voice flat. There was a brief moment of silence before the man gave a nod. "All right then. Keep your head low," he said, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan gave a small, tight nod, then turned and walked away, Clara close behind. They didn't need to stay long. Just long enough to find out where they could go next, long enough to breathe without looking over their shoulder every few seconds. The man's warning lingered in the air, but it wasn't the first time they had been warned. It wouldn't be the last. They found a small, abandoned building near the edge of town, its windows boarded up, its doors slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Ethan motioned for Clara to stay behind him as he pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the interior before stepping inside. Clara followed, grateful for the shelter, even if it felt temporary. The building was cold, the floor covered in dust, but it was a place to rest, and that was all that mattered. As Ethan began to secure the door, Clara sank to the floor, exhaustion settling in her bones. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence surround her. They were safe, for now, but the nagging feeling of being hunted never truly left her. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting near his rifle, but for once, he didn't speak. They were both lost in their thoughts, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. After a few minutes, Clara opened her eyes and looked at Ethan. "How long do we stay here?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan glanced at her, his expression still unreadable. "Not long," he said. "Just long enough to figure out what our next move is." Clara nodded, though the uncertainty of their situation weighed heavily on her. Every step they took, every decision they made, brought them closer to the inevitable. But she refused to let fear control her. She had made her choice, and she wasn't backing down. The sound of footsteps outside caught their attention. Clara tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she had tucked into her belt. Ethan was already standing, his eyes narrowed, his body poised for action. But the footsteps were slow, steady, and after a moment, they stopped. There was a knock on the door. Clara's heart raced as Ethan motioned for her to stay silent. He walked to the door, his movements calculated, before peeking through the crack. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Who is it?" There was no answer, just the sound of someone shifting outside the door. Clara could feel her pulse in her throat as she waited, every muscle tense. She had no idea who it could be, whether it was the lawman, the gang, or just someone passing through. Ethan motioned for Clara to stay back as he cautiously approached the door, hand on the handle. With one quick motion, he flung the door open, revealing a young woman standing there, looking just as wary as they were. She had dark hair, tightly braided, and a simple but worn dress. She held a small bundle in her arms, her eyes wide with fear. You don't belong here," the woman said, her voice trembling. Clara's heart dropped. She could see the desperation in the woman's eyes, the same fear that had haunted her own for days. But the woman wasn't running from danger, she was bringing it to their door. The young woman stood there, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling as she clutched the small bundle in her arms. Ethan's hand still rested on the door, his grip tightening as he assessed the situation. Clara remained behind him, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was this woman, and why had she come to them, of all people? The woman spoke again, her voice shaking. "They're coming. They'll be here soon. I couldn't outrun them. I don't know where else to go." Ethan's expression hardened, his gaze never leaving the woman's face. "Who is they? What's going on?" The woman hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if she feared someone would follow her. "The men who've been hunting you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to get caught up in this, but I saw you leave the river. I saw what happened, and I know they're after you. They'll stop at nothing." Clara's mind raced. The fear in the woman's eyes mirrored the same fear she had seen in her own reflection many times over the past few days. "Why are they after you?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the unease growing inside her. The woman swallowed hard. shifting the bundle in her arms. I didn't ask for this. I was just trying to survive. I'm just a farm girl from the next town over. But when they came for me, I had no choice. I ran. I'm not one of them, but I've seen enough to know what they're capable of. I saw the look in their eyes, the way they hunt. She paused, her face pale with fear. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't outrun them. I don't know where to go. Ethan's eyes flickered with something that looked like pity, but it was quickly replaced with resolve. He turned to Clara, his expression grim. We can't stay here. If they're already looking for us, they'll be on us before long. Clara nodded, her heart sinking at the thought of yet another chase, another flight from danger. But the woman had nowhere else to go, and Clara wasn't about to turn her away. What do you need from us? Clara asked, stepping forward, her voice softer now. The woman's gaze flickered between Ethan and Clara, as if she wasn't sure she could trust them. But in that moment, she had no choice. I need help. Please. I can't do this on my own. I just need somewhere to hide, somewhere they won't find me. Ethan let out a low breath, looking at the woman for a long moment. Then he turned to Clara. We can't let her stay here. It's too risky. Clara felt a tug in her chest, a desire to help this woman, who, in some ways, reminded her of herself, lost, desperate, running from a past she couldn't escape. But she also knew the dangers they faced. If the gang was already on their trail, taking in another person was dangerous. Where do we go, then? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the rising anxiety inside her. We need to get out of town, Ethan said quietly. There's a place about 20 miles north. It's an old cabin, one I've used before when things got too hot. It's isolated, but it's safe for now. We can't afford to stay in the open. Clara nodded, but a knot formed in her stomach. It wasn't just about finding a place to hide. The danger was closing in, and the stakes were higher than ever. We leave now, she said, her voice firm. Ethan gave her a long look, as if he were about to argue, but then he nodded. He didn't have time for arguments either. All right, he said, turning to the woman. You're coming with us. But you need to understand, we can't slow down. We can't afford to be seen. The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. They didn't waste any more time. They gathered their things quickly, the woman holding the bundle tightly to her chest as they made their way through the back alleys of the town, staying out of sight as much as possible. Every footstep felt like it was echoing too loudly, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air was thick with the tension of their flight, the promise of danger hanging over them like a storm cloud. As they made their way through the back roads and paths, Clara's mind raced. They had to get to the cabin, but what if they didn't make it? What if the gang found them before they had a chance to hide? The thought was almost too much to bear, but Clara pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to think like that. They had to make it. They had no other choice. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the cabin, hidden deep in the woods. It was a small, weathered structure, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown brush. Ethan motioned for them to stay close, and they quickly made their way inside, closing the door behind them. The cabin smelled musty, the walls covered in dust, but it was a refuge for now. Ethan locked the door behind them, his face tight with exhaustion. Clara collapsed onto one of the chairs, her body sore from the long walk. We'll rest here for a bit, Ethan said quietly. We've bought ourselves some time. But Clara knew better. Time was running out. And even in the safety of the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past was closing in on them faster than they could escape. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood settling in the cool night air. Clara sat by the small fire that flickered weakly in the hearth, the warmth of it doing little to quell the anxiety gnawing at her. Ethan had gone silent after securing the cabin. He sat across from her, his face shadowed, lost in thought. The past few days had been a blur of running, hiding, and fear. Clara knew they couldn't stay here long. They had bought themselves some time, but only just. And Clara could feel it. Everything was converging, every choice they had made leading them to this moment. They were trapped, not just by the people hunting them, but by the very life they had tried to outrun. Ethan, Clara said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with exhaustion. What happens now? Ethan's jaw tightened. Now we wait. Clara wasn't sure if it was the weight of the words or the tension between them, but she felt a knot tighten in her chest. Waiting wasn't a solution. It was just another way of stalling the inevitable. But she didn't press him for answers. They had both been running for too long. It wasn't just the gang they were running from anymore. It was the life Ethan had tried to leave behind, the consequences of his choices, and the price he had paid for freedom. The woman they had helped earlier was asleep in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale with fear. Clara's heart went out to her, but she couldn't help feeling the weight of their own situation. They were all running from something, from a past that wouldn't let them go. The sound of hooves in the distance made Clara's heart jump. She tensed, her breath catching in her throat. It had become a familiar sound, the sound of danger. Ethan stood up quickly, moving silently to the window. He didn't need to say anything. Clara could see the tension in his body, the way his eyes darted from the trees to the road, scanning for any sign of movement. She knew what he was thinking. The riders were close. The moment they had feared was upon them. They had nowhere to run this time. Ethan grabbed his rifle and motioned for Clara to stay down. He moved with the ease of someone who had lived his life in danger, who had known the cost of his choices. Clara watched him, her mind racing. They had fought to survive this far, but could they survive what was coming? Would they make it out alive, or was this the end of the road? Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but as Ethan moved to the door, she made a choice. She wouldn't wait in the shadows any longer. Clara stood and joined him, her own hand reaching for the knife she kept tucked in her belt. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Stay behind me," he said. Clara nodded, but the defiance in her heart told her that no matter what happened, she would face it beside him. The riders were almost at the cabin now, the sound of their hooves growing louder, each beat of the drum-like rhythm of their approach tightening the noose around them. Clara could feel the heat of the fire, the blood rushing in her ears. She wasn't ready to die, not like this, not in fear. She had made her peace with the choices she had made. Now, she would stand and face whatever came next. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to confront the riders. Clara didn't answer at first. She just nodded. There was nothing left to say. The riders were here, and there was no more running. It was time to face the past, the choices, and the consequences. Ethan opened the door with a slow, deliberate motion, his body tense as he stepped out into the cold night air. The riders were silhouetted against the dark sky, their figures looming like ghosts in the moonlight. There were 4 of them, each one riding with purpose, their eyes scanning the cabin, their faces unreadable. Ethan stepped forward, his rifle raised. "This is far enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. The riders stopped. Clara could see their eyes, sharp and calculating, but she didn't flinch. This was it. The moment they had both known was coming. One of the riders, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke. "You've made a lot of enemies, Ethan," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're not getting away this time." Ethan didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "I'm not running," he said simply. The scarred man chuckled darkly, then signaled to his men. "Then you'll die here, just like you deserve." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed calm, her eyes locked on Ethan. She wouldn't let him face this alone. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "If you're here to take him, you'll have to go through me first." The riders looked at her, surprised by her boldness. But Clara didn't back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The scarred man looked at her, then back at Ethan. "So, you've got a little fight left in you," he said. "I'll give you that. But it won't be enough." The tension was thick in the air, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing, the steady beat of their hearts. Clara and Ethan stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The choice had been made. They wouldn't run. Not anymore. In this gripping tale of survival and redemption, Clara and Ethan are caught in the dangerous web of their past as they fight to escape the shadows that follow them. With their lives constantly at risk, they are forced to make difficult decisions while facing a relentless pursuit. As they navigate treacherous paths, they uncover the strength and courage they never knew they had. These Western stories explore the unyielding determination of 2 individuals bound by fate, as they come to realize that running from their past may not be enough. In the unforgiving wild, trust, loyalty, and love are tested in the harshest of ways. From hidden dangers to life-altering choices, the raw and rugged world of these Western stories challenges Clara and Ethan to face their demons head-on. As they continue their fight for survival, their journey reflects the timeless essence of Western stories, where bravery and honor clash with the darker sides of humanity. The rugged wilderness becomes both their refuge and their peril, leaving them to confront not only the world around them, but their own fears and regrets. These Western stories weave a tale of strength, resilience, and the constant battle between the past and the future, reminding us of the courage it takes to carve a new path in a world filled with uncertainty.